Widowed at 67, she spent her last $5 on forgotten land. 3 months later, strangers followed her dog there. The house in Cleveland went quiet after the funeral. Too quiet. At 67, Eleanor Voss found herself standing in rooms that no longer echoed with conversation, only memory. So when a neglected piece of Appalachian land appeared at auction for $5, she did something no one expected. She bought it. What waited there wasn't fortune or comfort, but something that would bring people back. If you found yourself alone like Eleanor, would you stay where everything feels familiar, or risk starting over somewhere no one else believes in? Tell me what you'd do. The house felt smaller when Eleanor Voss unlocked the front door. Not physically smaller. The hallway still stretched the same 12 careful steps from the entry to the kitchen, and the faded runner rug still bore the outline where the vacuum never quite reached along the baseboards. But something inside it had collapsed inward, like air pulled from a room. She stepped in first, her black heels making a hollow sound against the hardwood. The scent of lilies followed her from the funeral home, clinging to her coat, sweet and faintly sour. For 42 years, she had walked through this door beside her husband. Today, she entered alone. Behind her, Ryan carried a folded metal chair someone had insisted she take home, though she had no idea why. Elise followed with a casserole dish wrapped in foil. They moved carefully, respectfully, as though the house itself were fragile. "Mom, you don't have to worry about any of this tonight," Ryan said gently. He set the chair against the wall near the stairs, as if it had always belonged there. "We'll take care of the paperwork this week. I can call the insurance company tomorrow." Elise was already in the kitchen, opening cabinets to find space for the food neighbors had sent. "You should probably think about downsizing," she added softly, not unkindly. "This place is a lot for one person." Eleanor nodded, though she hadn't asked a question. Her coat felt heavier than it should. She slipped it off and draped it over the banister. The living room curtains were half drawn, leaving the space washed in a gray November light that flattened everything: photographs, furniture, the empty recliner by the window. The recliner. For a moment she forgot to breathe, since it still leaned slightly to the left, where Harold had insisted it was more comfortable that way. His reading glasses rested on the side table beside it. A mug with a faint coffee ring sat near the armrest. No one had moved them. "Mom?" Elise's voice came from the kitchen doorway. "I'm fine," Eleanor replied, her voice steady in a way that surprised her. Milo padded forward from the hallway. The German shepherd had stayed close to her all day, pressed against her leg at the graveside, silent as earth fell on the casket. Now he moved slowly to the recliner and sat in front of it, ears slightly lowered. Eleanor crossed the room and knelt beside him. His fur was warm under her palm. He leaned into her touch without looking away from the chair. "I know," she whispered. Ryan cleared his throat. We should probably go over some things while we're all here." They sat at the dining table where Thanksgiving dinners had once stretched into laughter and arguments over cranberry sauce. Now 3 plates from the funeral reception rested untouched in the center. Ryan opened a small notebook. Elise folded her hands in front of her like a student waiting for instruction. "We'll need to figure out what to do with Dad's truck," Ryan began. "And the mortgage. Well, technically it's paid off, but there are still taxes, utilities. It might make sense to sell while the market's good." Elise nodded. "There are some really nice senior communities near me. Just to look at." "No pressure." "No pressure." Eleanor studied their faces. They looked tired, older than she remembered. Concern lined their expressions, not impatience. Thus they weren't trying to push her away. They were trying to help in the only way they knew how, through lists and plans and reasonable next steps. But as they spoke, the room seemed to recede from her. She could hear the words, insurance, estate accounts, maintenance, but they floated past without landing. No one mentioned Harold's laugh, or the way he whistled off-key while fixing the sink. No one asked about the roses he planted along the fence, or the dent in the garage wall from the time Ryan misjudged the brakes at 17. The memories sat between them like unopened letters. "We can come back next weekend," Elise said, standing. "Maybe start sorting things." Just don't rush anything, Ryan added quickly. Take your time. They hugged her in the entryway. Their embraces were warm, careful. Elise held on a second longer than usual. Ryan squeezed her shoulder before stepping out into the cold. When the door closed behind them, the silence arrived. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't crash in or echo. It simply settled, heavy and complete. Eleanor stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the absence. The refrigerator hummed faintly in the kitchen. A car passed outside. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Milo moved to her side again. She walked into the living room and lowered herself into the recliner. It felt wrong under her weight. The fabric still carried Harold's shape. She placed her hands on the armrests, imagining his fingers there, thick and scarred from decades of repairing city buses. For 42 years, they had filled this house with motion, arguments over television channels, on quiet evenings reading side by side, shared glances across crowded rooms. Now the house seemed to be holding its breath. Milo laid his head on her knee. "You're still here," she murmured. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the carpet. Eleanor didn't turn on the lights. At some point she rose and moved through the house, touching things lightly, as if confirming they were real. The kitchen counter worn smooth at the edge, the framed photographs along the hallway, the bedroom door slightly ajar. The bed was made. Harold's slippers waited neatly beside it. She sat on the edge of the mattress. The indentation where he used to lie had already softened, almost erased. "I don't know what to do now," she said into the quiet. There was no answer. Later, she returned to the living room and pulled a blanket around her shoulders. Milo settled at her feet, then shifted, climbing up beside her until his body pressed firmly against her side. His steady breathing filled the room in a way nothing else could. The night deepened outside the windows. For the first time since the funeral ended, since the condolences faded and the cars drove away, Eleanor understood something she had not expected. No one had abandoned her. Ryan and Elise loved her. They would call. They would visit. They would try to solve what they believed could be solved. But love did not prevent absence. This house, once alive with shared glances and unspoken routines, was now too wide, too quiet for a single heartbeat. Milo shifted, resting his chin across her lap. Eleanor closed her eyes and let her hand remain in his fur, feeling the warmth, the weight, the simple certainty of another living thing in the room. The open space did not close the next morning. It widened. Eleanor woke before dawn, disoriented for a moment by the silence. For 42 years, Harold had been the first sound in the house, clearing his throat, turning on the coffee maker, humming some half-remembered tune from the 70s. Now there was only the faint hum of the refrigerator and Milo's breathing from the rug beside the bed. She lay still, staring at the ceiling. The word downsizing drifted back to her, spoken softly by Elise the day before. Senior communities, market timing, practical steps. Practical felt like a language she no longer understood. She rose slowly and padded into the kitchen. The casserole dishes from the neighbors remained untouched on the counter. A sympathy card had slid halfway off the table, the gold lettering catching the early gray light. Milo followed her closely, brushing against her leg as she poured coffee into Harold's old mug without thinking. She paused when she realized what she had done and switched it for another cup. The house felt staged now, as though someone had paused a scene mid-performance and forgotten to call action again. After breakfast, she began opening drawers, not with urgency, but with a quiet need to move. Papers had collected over the years in careful stacks, utility bills, insurance statements, folded warranties for appliances that had long since been replaced. She carried a small box to the dining table and started sorting. And her late morning sunlight crept across the wood as she worked. Most of it was ordinary. Ads, expired coupons, notices she had meant to throw away months ago. Then she found an envelope she didn't recognize. It was cream-colored, slightly bent, with a county seal stamped in faded blue ink. The return address read, Clay County Property Administration, West Virginia. Eleanor frowned. She didn't remember signing up for anything in West Virginia. Milo, who had been dozing near the window, lifted his head the moment she picked up the envelope. She noticed the shift immediately. "You hear something?" she asked softly. His ears tilted forward, but his eyes were fixed not on the door, not on the street outside, on the paper in her hand. She slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Yet inside was a single-page notice announcing a public land auction. Unpaid taxes, abandoned parcels, minimum bid, $5. Several properties were listed by number and acreage. One entry caught her eye. Lot 47B, 9 acres, unimproved, rural access, no utilities, no current development permit. Starting bid, $5. $5. She read the line twice. It felt absurd. 9 acres of land for less than the cost of the lilies now wilting on her counter. The description was blunt. Steep terrain, limited road access. Unsuitable for commercial development. A handwritten note at the bottom in faint ink read, "Former mining site vicinity." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. 9 acres. She tried to picture it. Trees, hills, dirt instead of pavement. No sidewalks, no traffic light at the corner, no familiar grocery store down the block. As Milo rose and padded to her side, he rested his chin lightly on the table edge, his dark eyes moving from the paper to her face and back again. "You don't even know where it is," she murmured. But something in her chest tightened, not with fear exactly, but with a quiet stirring she hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't excitement. It was awareness. The house around her suddenly felt even more fixed in place, as though the walls had grown heavier overnight. She folded the paper carefully and set it aside. That afternoon, Ryan called. "Hey, Mom, just checking in." "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Good. I was thinking, I can come by Saturday. We can start looking at options, maybe meet with a realtor." Eleanor glanced at the folded notice on the table. "There's no rush," she replied. "Oh, well, it's just that the market's strong right now, and this place is big for you." She didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. Later, Elise called with similar concern wrapped in softer words. Assisted living brochures had already appeared in her email inbox. "Just information," Elise insisted. After the calls ended, Eleanor sat alone at the table again. Milo lay at her feet, but he kept lifting his head toward the folded notice as though it were emitting a sound only he could hear. She picked it up once more. Clay County, West Virginia. She had never been there. The map on her phone showed a scattering of green hills and winding roads. The property sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and narrow back routes. Unimproved. No utilities. $5. "Ridiculous," she whispered. Milo stood, as he placed one paw gently on her knee. It wasn't something he did often. Harold used to joke that Milo behaved more like a soldier than a pet. Alert, composed, rarely needy. But now his paw remained there, steady, insistent. She met his gaze. "What is it?" The dog did not look away. For the first time since the funeral, Eleanor felt something sharper than grief, something that felt almost like a direction. The house creaked as the furnace kicked on. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, its engine echoing down the street. Everything in her life remained exactly where it had been. Except her. The thought came quietly. What if I left before they decided I should? Not forever. Not necessarily, just somewhere else. She imagined selling the house, or not selling it yet. She imagined packing only what fit in the trunk of her car. But she imagined land stretching beyond sight, unmarked by routine. Milo let out a low breath and lowered his paw, but he did not return to his rug. He stayed close, watching. Eleanor folded the notice again and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. She did not call Ryan back. She did not tell Elise. She only sat there, staring at the late afternoon light slanting across the floorboards, and allowed the possibility to exist. $5. The number felt less absurd now. Eleanor did not tell anyone the morning she made the payment. She sat at the dining table with her laptop open, the county auction page glowing faintly against the dim kitchen light. The listing for Lot 47B had not changed. 9 acres. Unimproved. Clay County, West Virginia. Minimum bid, $5. She entered her information slowly, her fingers hovering over each key as if the act itself might undo her. When the confirmation email arrived, it felt oddly anticlimactic. No music swelled, no voice warned her against it. Just a simple line of text. Congratulations. You are now the owner of Lot 47B owner. The word startled her. Milo lifted his head from beneath the table the moment the notification chimed. He rose and came to her side, pressing his shoulder lightly against her leg. It's done, she whispered. The house did not react. 2 days later, Eleanor stood in the bedroom with an open suitcase on the bed. She had not decided whether she was leaving for good. She had not decided much of anything beyond this. She needed to see it. She folded practical clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, heavy socks. She packed a flashlight, a small first aid kit, bottled water, and a blanket from the hall closet. She hesitated at Harold's old toolbox before selecting only a hammer and a small pry bar. Milo watched from the doorway, alert but calm. When she carried the suitcase downstairs, she paused in the living room. The recliner stood exactly as she had left it. The framed photographs on the wall. Ryan in a baseball uniform, Elise at her high school graduation, Harold grinning beside a rebuilt engine, remained fixed in place. She walked to the mantel and picked up a small photograph of her and Harold taken years ago at Lake Erie. She studied it for a long moment before setting it back down. I'm just going to look, she said aloud, unsure whether she was speaking to him or herself. The drive out of Cleveland began beneath a low gray sky. Traffic thinned as she moved south, highways narrowing into 2-lane roads. Industrial buildings gave way to open stretches of farmland. The city skyline shrank in her rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. Milo sat upright in the passenger seat, ears pricked, nose occasionally brushing the cracked window as new scents rushed in. The radio remained off. Hours passed in steady rhythm, the hum of tires against pavement, the faint rattle of something loose in the dashboard. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly than she realized. She had not driven this far alone in years. As the land began to rise into the Appalachian foothills, the road curved more sharply. Forest pressed close on both sides. Small towns appeared briefly, gas stations, faded diners, a hardware store with peeling paint, before dissolving back into trees. The GPS directed her onto a narrower road, then another, until the pavement thinned to cracked asphalt and finally to gravel. She slowed the car. The sign marking Clay County leaned crookedly at the roadside, half swallowed by brush. Here we are, she murmured. The final mile felt longer than the rest of the drive combined. The gravel road grew uneven, dipping into shallow ruts. Branches brushed against the sides of the car with dry, scraping sounds. When the GPS announced she had arrived, Eleanor looked around in confusion. There was no gate, no driveway, only a narrow break in the tree line where old tire tracks vanished into overgrowth. She pulled the car forward cautiously. The clearing opened gradually, revealing a stretch of uneven ground tangled with weeds and young saplings. A rusted wire fence sagged near the edge of the property. Beyond it, the land rose toward a distant ridge. No house, no structure, no sign of habitation. 9 acres of quiet. She turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deeper than the one she had left in Cleveland. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of distance, from highways, from neighbors, from everything familiar. Milo jumped down first, landing lightly on the dirt. He stood still, scanning the tree line before taking a few slow steps forward. Eleanor stepped out of the car and felt the ground shift slightly under her shoes. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and cold earth. This was worse than described. The terrain sloped unevenly, broken by shallow depressions and clusters of rock. Thick brush made walking difficult. Fallen branches lay tangled across the ground, as if no one had touched the land in decades. She turned in a slow circle, trying to imagine what she had expected. Not this, she admitted to herself. She had pictured something rough but manageable, a small patch of open land, maybe an old shed, some sign that it had once been tended. Instead, it felt untouched and uninterested in her presence. A flicker of doubt rose in her chest. "What have I done?" she breathed. Milo had moved several yards away. He paused near a patch of taller grass, nose working the air. His tail remained level, not wagging, not lowered, simply alert. Eleanor walked toward him carefully, stepping over uneven ground. From where they stood, she could see the ridge more clearly now. It rose steeply, crowned with dense trees. No paths were visible from this distance. She imagined winter here. Snow covering the uneven earth. Wind cutting through the trees. No immediate neighbors. No streetlights. She felt small. The wind shifted, carrying a chill that cut through her jacket. She wrapped her arms around herself and glanced back at the car. She could turn around. She could drive back to Cleveland before sunset. Tell Ryan it had been a mistake. Laugh about it later. The option hovered there, reasonable and safe. Milo looked back at her. There was no urgency in his expression, no excitement, only steady attention as if waiting. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "I'm not leaving yet," she said quietly. She walked back to the car and opened the trunk. The broken-down camper she had arranged to purchase from a local listing, cheap and barely functional, would be delivered later that afternoon. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. She began clearing a small area near the edge of the clearing, pushing aside branches and flattening grass with deliberate, careful movements. The physical effort steadied her breathing. Each time she paused, the land remained silent. But not hostile, just indifferent. As the afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the uneven ground, Eleanor stood and surveyed the small patch she had cleared. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't comfortable. But it was a start. She looked once more toward the ridge rising beyond the trees. "I don't know what I'm searching for," she admitted softly. Milo came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing her leg. The uncertainty did not vanish, but neither did she. By late afternoon, a battered pickup truck rattled down the gravel road and into the clearing. A middle-aged man with a sunburned neck and grease-stained cap stepped out, introducing himself simply as Wade. He hauled the small camper off his trailer with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it too many times. "Not much," he said, glancing around the land. "But it'll keep the rain off." "That's enough," Eleanor replied. The camper was faded beige, its paint peeling along the edges. One window had been patched with clear plastic. The door stuck slightly when Wade demonstrated how to open it. Inside, the space smelled faintly of dust and old vinyl. Wade left before dusk, his truck disappearing down the gravel road in a cloud of pale brown dust. The sound of the engine faded quickly, swallowed by trees. Silence returned. Eleanor stood outside the camper for a long moment, watching the sky darken. The ridge to the east had already begun to blur into shadow. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun dipped behind the hills. Milo circled the perimeter of the clearing, nose low to the ground. Every few steps he paused, ears erect, scanning the tree line. "You're not in Cleveland anymore," she muttered to herself. She climbed into the camper and sat at the small dinette table bolted to the wall. The space was tight, barely wide enough for her to turn comfortably. A thin mattress occupied the back. The cabinets rattled when she closed them. She unpacked slowly, blanket on the bed, flashlight on the counter, bottled water stacked near the sink that did not run. Each movement felt deliberate, as if she were establishing boundaries against the vastness outside. When she stepped back out to retrieve her overnight bag, as the forest had grown darker, a distant rustling moved through the brush. She froze. The sound was subtle, leaves shifting, a branch snapping faintly somewhere beyond sight. Not loud, not aggressive, just present. Milo stiffened immediately. His posture changed in an instant from relaxed to alert, head lifted high, muscles tight beneath his coat. "What is it?" she whispered. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply watched. The forest seemed to lean closer. Eleanor swallowed and hurried back into the camper, closing the door firmly behind her. She locked it, though she knew how little that would matter if something larger decided to test it. Inside, the space felt smaller than before. She turned on the small battery-powered lantern she had brought. The yellow light flickered weakly against the thin walls. Wet wind moved through the trees, brushing branches together in soft scraping sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bird called once before falling silent. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and removed her shoes. "What have I done?" she murmured again. But the question felt heavier now. The house in Cleveland had been quiet, yes, but it had been predictable. Streetlights, neighbors, the familiar rhythm of passing cars. Here, the dark felt complete. Milo jumped up beside her, settling near the door rather than at her feet. His body faced outward, ears angled toward every sound. "You're guarding it?" she asked softly. He did not move. As night deepened, the forest came alive in unfamiliar ways. A sharp cry echoed somewhere to the north, high and sudden. Eleanor flinched. Another rustle followed closer to the camper, and with a faint crunch of leaves under weight. Her heart pounded. She switched off the lantern, unsure whether the light made her feel safer or more exposed. Darkness filled the camper instantly. Through the thin walls, every sound felt magnified. The wind rose, pressing against the side of the camper with a hollow thud. Something brushed briefly against the metal, perhaps a branch, perhaps more. Milo let out a low, controlled growl. "Easy," she whispered, reaching for him in the dark. Her hand found his back. Warm, solid, real. The growl subsided, but his body remained tense. Minutes stretched long and thin. Eleanor's breathing felt too loud inside the small space. She tried to count the seconds between gusts of wind. She tried to imagine this as an adventure rather than a mistake. But fear crept in regardless. No, not fear of something specific. No visible threat, no direct danger. But fear of isolation. Of being too far from help. Of having chosen wrong. Her phone signal had already flickered weakly when she arrived. If something happened, it would take time for anyone to reach her. She closed her eyes, though sleep felt impossible. At some point past midnight, exhaustion began to dull the sharp edges of her anxiety. The wind eased. The forest settled into a steadier rhythm of distant calls and soft movements. Milo shifted slightly, but he did not lie down fully. He remained half upright, positioned between her and the door. She listened to his breathing, slow, steady. Gradually, her own breath followed that pace. When she woke again, it was to pale blue light filtering through the plastic-patched window. But for a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then the smell of cold earth drifted faintly through the thin walls. She sat up carefully. The forest outside looked almost gentle in the early morning light. Sunlight slipped between branches, illuminating patches of mist hovering just above the ground. She opened the camper door slowly. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks. Dew clung to the grass. The clearing she had begun the day before looked smaller now against the vast stretch of trees beyond it. Milo jumped down first and scanned the perimeter once more before relaxing slightly. Eleanor stepped out, drawing in a deep breath. Nothing had attacked the camper. No footprints surrounded it. No signs of intrusion beyond a few scattered leaves against the side panel. The fear of the night felt distant in the calm of morning. But the doubt remained. She turned slowly, taking in the ridge again rising beyond the tree line. It looked less ominous in daylight, just a slope covered in green and brown. Still, something about it held her gaze longer than the rest of the land. Milo followed her line of sight. He stood very still, facing the ridge as though measuring it. The fear of the night had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. And as Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the cold, she understood that the land was not going to welcome her gently. If she stayed, she would have to learn it. Milo did not take his eyes off the ridge. The morning light softened the land, but it did not tame it. Mist clung low along the uneven ground, rising in thin ribbons as the sun strengthened. While Eleanor brewed coffee on the small camping stove outside the camper, the scent mingling with damp earth and crushed grass, Milo remained standing, angled toward the slope beyond the clearing. "You're going to stare a hole through it," she said quietly. He didn't move. Eleanor followed his gaze again. The ridge rose higher than she'd noticed the day before, its incline steeper than it appeared from a distance. The tree line there was denser, darker, as though the sunlight hesitated before entering. She drank her coffee slowly and tried to ignore the tug in her chest. The day passed in small, deliberate tasks. She dragged fallen branches into piles. She marked a rough perimeter of the clearing with bright ribbon she had packed from home. She tested the ground near the camper to see where it might flood if it rained. Each time she paused to rest, Milo returned to his position facing the ridge. At first she assumed he was responding to scent, wildlife perhaps, a deer trail, a raccoon den. But as the hours passed, she noticed something else. He did not react the same way toward the woods behind her or along the gravel road. Only the ridge held him. He refused to lie down fully unless he was positioned facing it. Even when she sat on the camper step to eat a sandwich mid-afternoon, he stood nearby, occasionally glancing at her but always returning his focus to that slope. "Is something up there?" she asked. The land offered no answer. By late afternoon, curiosity edged out the lingering fear from the night before. The forest sounds now felt less like threats and more like a language she had not yet learned to translate. Eleanor wiped her hands on her jeans and stood. "All right," she said. "Let's see what you see." Milo moved instantly, stepping ahead of her but not running. His pace was measured, deliberate. The grass grew thicker as they moved away from the clearing. The ground shifted unevenly underfoot, forcing her to watch each step carefully. Fallen leaves masked shallow dips in the earth. After only a few yards, the forest swallowed most of the light behind them. The air cooled. Milo slowed near a cluster of young trees and paused. Eleanor looked around, breathing lightly. The ridge loomed closer now. She could see the steep incline more clearly, rocks protruding through the soil in uneven patterns. But there was something else. A break in the undergrowth. As it was subtle, a narrow stretch where brush thinned and the ground appeared slightly worn, as though feet had passed through long ago. Not recently. Not enough to form a visible trail from afar, but enough that the plants there grew differently. Milo stepped onto that faint path. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with alertness. "You've been up here before?" she murmured, though she knew he hadn't. She followed him carefully, pushing aside low branches. The path curved slightly toward the left, angling toward a natural dip in the hillside. As they climbed, Eleanor noticed the ground grew firmer in patches, less tangled with roots. Someone had once walked this way. The realization unsettled and intrigued her at the same time. Halfway up the incline, Milo stopped again. He stood very still, head lifted, ears angled forward. And Eleanor listened. No wind, no animal movement. Just the faint creak of trees settling in the afternoon heat. She stepped forward beside him and studied the area. There, partially obscured by brush, was a flat stone set upright in the soil. It didn't belong to the natural pattern of the ridge. It stood too straight, too deliberate. She crouched and brushed leaves away from its surface. The stone was weathered, its edges softened by time. Near the top, faint markings cut into the surface caught the light at a particular angle. She leaned closer. The carving was shallow, almost erased, but not entirely gone. It resembled letters, perhaps initials, though too worn to read clearly. Her pulse quickened. "This isn't just empty land," she whispered. Milo shifted slightly, glancing farther up the ridge. Eleanor straightened slowly. The faint path continued beyond the stone, though it grew steeper and less visible. She hesitated. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here. Ryan believed she was thinking things over. Elise assumed she was resting. The thought struck her suddenly. If she twisted an ankle up here, it might take hours before anyone even realized she was missing. But she didn't step back. Instead, she placed her hand lightly against the stone. The surface felt cool despite the sunlight. Milo moved forward again, climbing another few yards before stopping once more. This time, Eleanor noticed a change in the soil near his paws. The ground dipped slightly, as if something beneath it had shifted long ago. She crouched carefully and pushed aside leaves. There were fragments there, small pieces of rusted metal half buried in the earth. She brushed at one with her fingers and uncovered the edge of what looked like an old tool handle. Not recent, not modern. She sat back on her heels. The land had been described as former mining site vicinity. Vicinity. This felt closer than vicinity. Milo let out a low breath and stepped back toward her, brushing against her shoulder as if urging her to look beyond what lay at her feet. She followed his gaze. Higher up the ridge, partially hidden by brush and shadow, she noticed a subtle line cutting horizontally across the slope, a darker strip where vegetation grew unevenly, a trace of something larger. The forest around them remained quiet, not empty. Waiting. Eleanor felt the shift inside her. The fear from the night before had not vanished, but it had been replaced by something sharper, yet something that felt almost like invitation. "This isn't random," she said softly. Milo's tail moved once, slow and controlled. She stood and looked back down toward the clearing. The camper appeared small from this height, barely visible through the trees. The land did not feel indifferent anymore. It felt layered. She placed her hand on Milo's head briefly. "We're not done," she told him. The dog remained fixed on the ridge, as if he had known that all along. They didn't climb any farther that afternoon. The slope steepened sharply beyond the faint line in the brush, and Eleanor felt the strain in her knees after only a few more cautious steps. She marked the spot in her memory, the upright stone, the rusted fragments in the soil, and slowly made her way back down. The clearing looked different when she returned. Smaller. Less like an isolated accident, and more like the edge of something larger she hadn't yet seen. That evening, she sat outside the camper with a notebook in her lap. The forest hummed gently around her, crickets beginning their steady rhythm, wind threading through branches. She sketched a rough map of the property as she understood it so far. The gravel entrance, the clearing, the ridge rising beyond. She marked the location of the stone with a small X. Milo lay nearby, but his head remained angled toward the slope. "You're still thinking about it," she said softly. So was she. The next morning, Eleanor decided she needed context. She drove 15 minutes down the gravel road to the nearest town, a small cluster of buildings tucked into a valley between low hills. A faded sign read, "Glen Hollow." The town felt half awake, and a single gas pump stood outside a convenience store. Across the road, a narrow brick building bore a wooden sign that read, "Harlan's Hardware and Supply." She parked and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly. The store smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and old coffee. Shelves held coils of rope, paint cans, work gloves, and fishing gear. Behind the counter stood a tall, thin man in his late 60s, his gray hair pulled back loosely at the nape of his neck. "Morning," he said, voice steady and measured. "Morning," Eleanor replied. She bought a pair of heavy-duty gloves and a small hand shovel she hadn't realized she would need. As he rang up the purchase, his eyes lingered on her. "You're not from around here." "No," she admitted. "I bought some land off the auction, lot 47B. The man paused. That ridge property?" "I believe so." He studied her for a long moment. "That place hasn't had an owner in years. Most folks avoid it." "Why?" He leaned one elbow on the counter. "Used to be part of an old mining settlement. Not much left now." Eleanor felt her pulse shift. "What happened?" He glanced toward the front window, as though measuring how much to say. "Collapse," he replied. "Early 1950s. Not a big operation, but big enough for the families who depended on it. Shaft gave way. Took several men with it." "And the town?" "Packed up slow. Some left right away. Others tried to hold on. But once the mine closed, there wasn't much reason to stay." He straightened and folded the receipt carefully before handing it to her. "Some say there were parts of the settlement farther up the ridge. Storage sheds, equipment, maybe even living quarters before the families moved lower." Eleanor's mind returned instantly to the stone and the rusted fragments. "Were all the remains recovered?" she asked quietly. He shook his head once. "Not all." The words settled heavily between them. "I'm Robert Harlan," he added. "Store's been in my family since before the mine shut down." "Eleanor Voss," he nodded. You staying out there? For now. He studied her again, not with judgment, but with something closer to concern. Land like that holds more than trees, he said finally. Just take your time with it. She nodded, unsure what else to say. The drive back felt shorter. The forest seemed less random now, less chaotic. It carried history beneath the surface, unseen but present. When she returned to the clearing, Milo greeted her with quiet intensity, circling once before leading her back toward the ridge without hesitation. You know, she said, adjusting the gloves onto her hands. They climbed together, this time more directly. Eleanor felt steadier in her steps, less hesitant than the day before. At the upright stone, she paused briefly, brushing her fingers over the faint carving once more. Then they continued. The faint horizontal line she had seen earlier became clearer as they approached. What had looked like uneven vegetation from below resolved into the collapsed remains of wooden structures. Weathered beams lay scattered, half buried in soil and leaf litter. Rusted hinges clung to warped boards. A fragment of what might once have been a doorframe leaned crookedly against the slope. She moved slowly among the remains. There were tools here, pickaxe heads dulled by time, and broken lantern casings, scraps of metal piping. The ground bore subtle depressions, as though foundations once rested there. Milo paced carefully through the area, nose close to the earth, but movements controlled, respectful. Eleanor crouched near a partially buried object and cleared soil away with the hand shovel. A child's marble rolled free into her palm. She stared at it. The glass had clouded slightly over decades, but faint swirls of blue still shimmered within it. This had not just been a work site. Families had stood here. Children had played near these structures. Lives had unfolded on this ridge. The wind moved through the trees again, carrying the faint scent of damp stone. Eleanor rose slowly and surveyed the remains. The land no longer felt empty. It felt unresolved. She imagined the suddenness of the collapse Robert had described. The sound, the dust, the waiting families. Some remains never recovered. The phrase echoed quietly in her mind. Milo stopped near a cluster of rocks farther up the slope. He stood very still. Eleanor approached carefully. The rocks were stacked irregularly, but deliberately, forming a low, uneven barrier against the hillside. She knelt beside them and pressed her gloved hand against the cold stone. Beneath it, the earth felt hollow. Her breath caught. This was not random collapse. This was something covered. She pulled her hand back slowly. The unease settled deeper now, not fear of the dark forest, but of what lay beneath it. The ridge was not just holding remnants of buildings. It was holding memory. Milo looked at her steadily, and as though waiting for her to understand what he already sensed. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, wind moving softly around them. The land was not abandoned. It was carrying something that had never been fully brought to light, and she had just stepped into it. Eleanor stood beside the uneven stack of rocks, her gloved hand still hovering near the stone. The wind moved softly across the ridge, stirring dry leaves into brief, whispering spirals. Milo shifted his weight and stepped closer to the rock formation. He lowered his head and sniffed along the seam where stone met earth, then pawed lightly at the soil. Not frantically, not wild, deliberately. Her pulse quickened. "You smell something?" she asked, though she already knew he did. He pawed again, this time at a narrow gap near the base of the rocks, while Eleanor crouched and brushed away loose leaves. The soil here was packed more tightly than elsewhere, as though it had once been pressed into place. She pushed gently against one of the smaller stones. It moved, only slightly, but enough. Her breath caught. She worked slowly, careful not to dislodge anything too quickly. One by one, she shifted the lighter rocks aside. The heavier ones required both hands and steady pressure. Milo stood beside her, alert but patient. When she removed the third stone, a dark opening revealed itself beneath the pile, a shallow recess in the hillside, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Cold air drifted from it. Not a breeze, a presence. Eleanor leaned closer, peering into the narrow gap. The darkness inside was thick, absorbing the daylight. Her throat tightened. Yet this was not a natural hollow. The edges of the opening were reinforced with timber beams, weathered and darkened with age. The wood bore faint tool marks, as though cut by hand long ago. A concealed entrance. The realization sent a ripple of tension through her chest. Milo let out a low, controlled breath and shifted closer to the opening. "No," she whispered instinctively, placing a hand lightly on his collar. "Wait." She reached for the flashlight clipped to her belt and switched it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing a short tunnel sloping gently inward. The air smelled of damp stone and something older, like paper sealed too long in a box. She swallowed. The rational voice in her mind urged caution. The timber could be unstable, the ground uneven, the opening partially collapsed. But beneath the caution, something else stirred. Responsibility. If this was connected to the mine, to the families Robert had mentioned, if something had been intentionally covered here, she needed to see. "Stay close," she told Milo softly. She lowered herself carefully to her knees and leaned into the opening, angling the flashlight ahead. The tunnel extended only a few feet before widening into a small chamber carved into the hillside. It was not large, perhaps 8 feet across, with a ceiling low enough that she would need to crouch. But it was intact. Wooden supports framed the interior walls. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed for decades. She hesitated only a moment longer before easing herself inside. The temperature dropped immediately. Milo followed without hesitation, moving slightly ahead but staying within reach of her light, as the beam illuminated shapes along the far wall. Not rock. Objects. She drew in a slow breath. Against the timber supports sat a small wooden crate, its lid partially broken. Beside it rested a rusted lantern, its glass chimney cracked but intact. A pair of worn leather boots lay neatly positioned near the back corner, as though their owner had intended to return. The air felt heavy, not suffocating, but saturated with stillness. She stepped farther in, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. To the right, a narrow shelf had been carved directly into the stone. On it sat several tin cups, a folded wool blanket sealed inside oilcloth, and a stack of yellowed papers tied together with twine. Her heart pounded louder in the confined space. This was not debris. This had been preserved. Milo moved toward the back wall and sat, eyes scanning the chamber. Eleanor approached the crate first. Inside, she found small, personal items, a pocket watch with a cracked face, a child's drawing folded carefully, a handful of coins bearing dates from the early 1950s. She handled each piece gently, as if the people who once owned them might step back into the room at any moment. Her flashlight beam shifted to the stack of papers. She reached for them slowly. The twine disintegrated at her touch, brittle with age. The top page revealed faded handwriting in blue ink. Names, dates, short lines of text that resembled ledger entries. She knelt and read the first clear line she could make out. Families notified, remains not yet located. Her breath caught. She turned another page. Lists of names followed. Men, presumably minors. But beside several entries were small notations. Recovered, pending, unknown. The word unknown appeared more than once. This was not simply storage. This was record. Documentation someone had chosen to protect. The weight of it pressed against her ribs. "Why hide this?" she whispered. Milo rose and stepped toward the far corner, nudging something partially concealed beneath the blanket on the shelf. Eleanor directed the light there. A metal container sat tucked against the stone wall, its surface dulled but intact. It was sealed with a small latch, still closed. Her fingers hovered over it. Fear flickered briefly, not of danger, but of significance. Whatever lay inside had been intentionally placed here, shielded from collapse, from weather, from time. She hesitated, yet then she lifted the container carefully and placed it on the chamber floor. The latch resisted at first, but gave with steady pressure. The lid creaked open. Inside she found photographs, black and white images, edges curled slightly but preserved. Families standing in front of modest wooden homes, children gathered near the mouth of a mine shaft. Men lined shoulder to shoulder in work clothes, faces smudged but smiling. She flipped through them slowly. On the bottom lay a folded letter, sealed in an envelope addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Her breath steadied. The unease she had felt on the ridge shifted again. This was no longer just about what had happened here. It was about what had never been told. Milo sat beside her, his presence steady in the confined space. Eleanor looked around the small chamber once more. The boots, the lantern, the names written carefully in fading ink. The land had not been abandoned by accident. It had been carrying something. And now, kneeling in the dim light of her flashlight, she understood that she was the first person in decades to see it. Fear had brought her to the edge of this discovery. Responsibility held her there. She gathered the photographs and papers carefully, placing them back into the metal container for now. She would need to read them in full, in daylight, somewhere stable. As she crawled back toward the entrance, Milo moving just ahead, the forest outside seemed quieter than before. Not empty. Watchful. She emerged into the late afternoon light and blinked against the brightness. The ridge stretched around her, unchanged to any passerby, but beneath it, something had been waiting. And she had opened the door. Eleanor did not sleep much that night. The metal container sat on the small dinette table inside the camper, its lid closed again, but no longer sealed. The flashlight lay beside it, batteries dimming. Milo positioned himself beneath the table, close enough that his shoulder touched her foot. The forest outside carried its usual rhythm. Wind, insects, distant rustles. But the sounds no longer felt like warnings. They felt like background to something far more immediate. She reached for the container. The lid creaked softly as she opened it again. Under the yellow lantern light, the photographs appeared almost luminous. She lifted the first one carefully. A woman stood on a wooden porch, her hair pinned neatly back, one hand resting on a small boy's shoulder. Sure, the boy's boots were too large for his feet. On the back, written in faded pencil, were two names: Daniel Carter, June 1951. Eleanor traced the letters gently with her fingertip. Another photograph showed a group of miners standing near what must have been the original shaft entrance. Their expressions were not solemn. They looked proud, confident. She imagined them walking up that ridge each morning, boots striking dirt, lunch pails swinging at their sides. She set the photographs aside and unfolded the letter addressed, "To whoever finds this." The paper was brittle, the edges browned with time. The handwriting was steady. "If you are reading this, then the ground has finally given back what it kept from us. We were told to move on. We were told to forget. But some of our men were never brought home. These records are what remain. We kept them here because we believed one day someone would care enough to look." Eleanor's throat tightened. She read slowly, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The writer, unsigned, described the collapse, the confusion, the incomplete recovery. There were names repeated again and again, followed by words like unconfirmed and presumed. These were not official reports. These were personal records, the kind kept by someone who refused to let memory fade quietly. She set the letter down and reached for the stack of documents tied with twine earlier. Under the lantern light, she examined each page. There were lists of families, addresses, notes scribbled in margins, references to belongings stored until found. She began to understand. The small chamber was not meant as a hiding place. Oh, it was a safeguard. The settlement may have dissolved, but someone had preserved what mattered. Milo shifted beneath the table and lifted his head as if responding to a distant sound. Eleanor paused and listened. Nothing unusual. Yet she noticed something else. The fear she had felt during her first night on the land was gone. In its place was something steadier. Connection. She no longer felt like an intruder on empty ground. She felt like a witness. Over the next few days, she returned to the ridge repeatedly. Each time, Milo led her with quiet certainty. He would stop near specific points, places she had overlooked at first glance. Near the collapsed beams, he unearthed a rusted tin box, half buried beneath a fallen plank. Inside were children's drawings folded into careful squares. Farther up the slope, And he paused near a cluster of stones where Eleanor found fragments of enamelware plates, cracked but intact. She began to map each discovery in her notebook. Her sketch of the property grew more detailed: clearing, ridge, chamber, storage remains. She marked the locations with symbols, noting what had been found at each site. The land shifted in her mind from terrain to story. On the fourth evening, she sat outside the camper with the photographs spread gently across the small folding table she had set up. The air was warmer now. Fireflies blinked faintly near the edge of the trees. Milo lay beside her, head resting on his paws, but eyes open. She picked up one photograph in particular, a group portrait of 3 families standing together, children in the front row, adults behind them. The same boy appeared in more than one image. Oh, Daniel Carter. She wondered if he had descendants somewhere who had grown up hearing fragments of this place. Did anyone still remember? Her phone signal was unreliable at best, but she climbed slightly higher up the clearing, where reception seemed stronger. She typed carefully into a small online history forum dedicated to Appalachian mining towns. Recently purchased land in Clay County, West Virginia. Discovered preserved documents and photographs from a former mining settlement, early 1950s. Names include Daniel Carter and others listed as unrecovered following collapse. Seeking historical information or family connections. She hesitated before pressing post. Then she did. Back at the camper, she placed the photographs back inside the container, careful to preserve their order. The forest felt different now. Not quieter. Fuller. And as darkness settled, Milo rose and walked slowly to the edge of the clearing. He stood facing the ridge again, but his posture was relaxed this time. She joined him. "You knew it was there," she said softly. He glanced at her briefly, then back toward the slope. She looked up at the ridge, no longer as a threat or a mystery. It felt like a conversation waiting to continue. When she returned to the camper and lay down that night, she left the lantern burning low. The chamber on the ridge was no longer a secret hidden in earth. It was a bridge. And for the first time since she had left Cleveland, Eleanor did not feel alone in the dark. She felt accompanied, not just by Milo, but by voices that had never truly left this land. They had simply been waiting for someone to listen. The forum post received no response the first night, or the second. Eleanor checked her phone each morning by walking to the higher patch of ground near the clearing's edge where the signal flickered faintly between one bar and none. Milo followed her each time, sitting patiently as she refreshed the page. On the third afternoon, a notification appeared. A reply. Her heart skipped as she opened it. "My grandfather was Daniel Carter. He worked in Clay County before the collapse. Family always said he was never properly recovered. Do you have a photograph?" The message was signed simply. Clara M. Eleanor sat down slowly on a fallen log. She reread the line twice. Grandfather. The boy in the oversized boots. The photograph trembled slightly in her hands as she returned to the camper and opened the metal container. She found the image of the woman and child on the porch and took a clear picture with her phone, careful not to expose it too long to sunlight. She sent it. The reply came faster this time. "That's him. That's my grandfather." Eleanor's throat tightened. They exchanged a few more messages. Clara lived 2 counties over. Her grandmother had kept stories alive about the ridge but never knew exactly where the settlement had been. "I'd like to come," Clara wrote. Eleanor hesitated only a moment. "Yes," she typed. "You should." 2 days later, a silver sedan crept slowly down the gravel road and stopped at the edge of the clearing. A woman in her early 40s stepped out. She had dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and held a small envelope tightly in one hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're Eleanor?" Clara asked softly. "Yes." Clara looked around the clearing, her eyes scanning the ridge beyond. There was a tension in her posture, hope tangled with uncertainty. "I didn't think anyone would ever find anything," she said. Eleanor nodded. "I didn't mean to," she admitted. "Milo did." At the sound of his name, Milo approached Clara cautiously, but without suspicion. He stopped a few feet away, studying her face. Clara crouched instinctively. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He's persistent," Eleanor replied gently. They climbed the ridge together, Eleanor leading at first, Clara close behind. Milo moved slightly ahead, glancing back occasionally as if ensuring they followed. The faint path was clearer now. Eleanor had trimmed back a few low branches over the past days. When they reached the upright stone, Clara stopped. "My grandmother used to talk about a marker near the upper houses," she said quietly. "She never knew if it was real." Eleanor stepped aside. Clara touched the weathered stone with trembling fingers. Milo moved on. He walked directly toward the collapsed beams and then past them, continuing higher along the slope toward the cluster of rocks that concealed the chamber. Eleanor felt a ripple of anticipation. Clara followed silently. When Milo stopped at the stone barrier and sat, Clara's breath caught. "This is it?" she whispered. Eleanor knelt and began removing the smaller stones again, careful and deliberate. Clara crouched beside her. As the opening revealed itself, the cool air drifting outward brushed across Clara's face. "Oh," she breathed. Inside, Eleanor let Clara enter first. The chamber was dim, but intact. The lantern light cast long shadows across the timber supports. Clara moved slowly, as if stepping into a sacred space. Her eyes fell immediately on the shelf carved into the stone. She approached it carefully. When she saw the boots in the corner, she covered her mouth. "My grandmother said he left in those," she whispered. Eleanor felt her own eyes sting. Clara knelt and reached for the stack of documents. She recognized the handwriting instantly. "That's my great-uncle's writing," she said, voice breaking. "He tried to keep records after the officials stopped." Milo stood quietly behind them, his body relaxed, as though his task had been completed. Clara turned toward Eleanor, tears streaming freely now. "No one ever believed there would be anything left," she said. They thought it was all lost." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "It wasn't lost," she replied. "Just covered." They spent hours in the chamber that afternoon. Clara photographed each page carefully, each name, each notation. She traced her grandfather's image in the photographs with reverent fingertips. When they stepped back into the daylight, Clara remained still for a long moment, looking out over the ridge. "My grandmother died thinking this place had erased him," she said quietly. "But it didn't." Milo moved to Clara's side and leaned lightly against her leg. She let out a small, broken laugh through tears. "He led us back," she said softly. Eleanor felt the words settle into the air, back. That evening, Clara stayed long enough to watch the sun dip below the trees. She stood in the clearing, while looking up at the ridge one last time before returning to her car. "I'll tell my family," she promised. "They deserve to know." As the sedan disappeared down the gravel road, Eleanor stood beside Milo in the fading light. The clearing did not feel isolated anymore. It felt connected. A single person had come, and she had not left empty-handed. Eleanor looked at Milo. "You knew," she said. He gazed toward the ridge again, but this time not as a sentinel, as a guide. Clara's visit did not end with her departure. 2 days later, Eleanor's phone buzzed again at the edge of the clearing. Another message. "My father would like to come. He's Daniel's son. He's 82. Eleanor read the words twice before answering. "Yes," she typed. "We'll be here." By the end of the week, another vehicle rolled slowly down the gravel road. Now, it's this one older, its engine louder. A man stepped out carefully, supported by a cane and Clara's steady arm. His face carried the weight of years, but when he looked toward the ridge, something in his expression sharpened. "Up there?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. The climb was slow this time. Eleanor walked beside him, offering her arm when the incline steepened. Milo moved gently ahead, pausing often, never straying far. At the upright stone, the elderly man stopped. "My mother described this," he whispered. "Said there was a marker near the upper homes." His hand trembled as he touched it. Milo moved forward again, leading them to the chamber. Inside, the old man removed his hat and stood silently for a long moment. His eyes found the boots in the corner. "He never came home," he said, voice barely audible. But he didn't disappear." The words lingered in the cool air. Eleanor stepped back, giving them space. Outside, the forest moved gently in the breeze. After that day, the messages multiplied. Clara had shared photographs with relatives. One family told another. Names in the records connected to branches of family trees scattered across West Virginia and beyond. Within 2 weeks, the clearing saw visitors almost daily. Not crowds, individuals. A middle-aged woman searching for confirmation of a great-grandfather's name. A young man holding a faded photograph of 2 brothers. A retired schoolteacher who remembered her grandmother speaking of the ridge that swallowed men. Each arrival carried a different expression. Hope, skepticism, grief long settled but not healed. And each time Milo met them at the edge of the clearing. But he did not bark or rush. He observed. Then, almost instinctively, he would turn and walk toward the ridge. Eleanor began to notice the pattern. He would slow near specific areas, pausing beside certain collapsed beams or stones. Visitors often reacted there, recognizing something in a location, a photograph, a name. It was as if Milo sensed not just scent, but story. The land changed gradually. Eleanor cleared a wider path up the ridge, careful not to disturb what remained. She placed small wooden markers near key points, labeling them simply. Settlement remains, storage area, record chamber. She added nothing decorative, only clarity. The chamber itself became a space of quiet reverence. Visitors entered slowly, some removing hats, others placing a hand against the timber supports as if greeting something living. Eleanor installed a simple waterproof container near the entrance where families could leave copies of photographs or written memories. By the 3rd week, the clearing no longer felt like an accident of wilderness. It felt purposeful. One afternoon, as Eleanor stood near the camper organizing her notebook, she heard multiple engines approaching. 3 vehicles. They parked unevenly along the gravel stretch, doors opening in staggered rhythm. Families stepped out, some related, some strangers to each other until now. Children followed, quieter than usual, sensing the tone of the place. Eleanor felt a flicker of nervousness. Was this becoming too much? Too exposed? But when she looked at Milo, he remained calm. He walked toward the group and then began the climb without hesitation. They followed. The path up the ridge bore clearer shape now, worn by repeated footsteps. Not damage, just evidence. At the stone marker, someone paused to take a photograph. At the collapsed beams, another knelt, brushing soil aside carefully as though searching for something specific. In the chamber, the air held the scent of earth and lantern oil. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, reading names softly aloud. Some cried. Some simply stood in silence. Eleanor remained near the entrance, watching. This was no longer just her discovery. It belonged to them. As the afternoon stretched into evening, people lingered in the clearing below. They shared stories beside parked cars. They compared photographs. They connected names from different branches of history. For the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor heard laughter echo lightly between the trees. Not loud, gentle. Life returning in fragments. Milo lay near the edge of the clearing, eyes half closed but ears alert. A young boy approached him cautiously. "Is he the one who found it?" the boy asked. Eleanor smiled. "He's the one who kept looking." The boy nodded solemnly and reached out to touch Milo's back. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, Eleanor felt something shift inside her again. The land no longer felt like a question. It felt like an answer unfolding. Cars began to leave slowly as dusk approached, headlights flickering on one by one. Families promised to return. Some asked if they could help preserve the area, perhaps build a small sign, maybe arrange a simple gathering. Eleanor listened carefully. "Oh, this place doesn't need to be polished," she said gently. "It just needs to be remembered." They agreed. When the last vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence that had greeted her on her first night. It was fuller, layered. Milo stood and stretched, then walked toward the ridge once more, pausing at its base. Eleanor joined him. From where they stood, she could see the faint outlines of the settlement against the slope, the subtle markers she had placed, the path worn by returning footsteps. The land that had once been described as worthless now carried voices again, And as twilight settled over the trees, Eleanor understood something quietly powerful. She had not brought people here. Milo had. He had led them back. 3 months after Eleanor first arrived with nothing but a camper and a question she couldn't name, the gravel road no longer felt forgotten. It was still narrow, still uneven, but tire tracks marked it regularly now. A simple wooden sign stood at the entrance to the clearing, hand-carved by a local carpenter who had once traced his own family line to the ridge. It read, "Glen Hollow Settlement in memory of those unrecovered. No grand monument. No polished plaque. Just acknowledgement." Eleanor stood near the edge of the clearing early that morning, watching a small group gather at the base of the path. Some carried folding chairs. Others held envelopes or laminated photographs protected from weather. Milo moved among them calmly, brushing lightly against hands extended toward him. Yet his name had traveled quietly through family messages and phone calls. The dog who found it, people would say. Eleanor had stopped correcting them. She knew he hadn't found the land. He had simply refused to ignore it. The ridge bore clearer shape now. The faint path had become gently worn, but still natural. Eleanor had reinforced sections with flat stones where erosion threatened, careful not to disturb the original layout. The chamber remained untouched structurally, though a small lantern now hung safely near its entrance for visitors. That morning marked exactly 3 months since she had driven into the clearing alone. 3 months since fear had kept her awake in the camper. 3 months since Milo first stood facing the ridge without explanation. Now voices drifted through the trees almost daily. So some visitors stayed an hour. Others lingered the entire afternoon, walking slowly, tracing beams with fingertips, whispering names into air that once held silence. Eleanor did not organize tours. She did not charge fees. She simply welcomed, and people came. Late that afternoon, as sunlight filtered through branches in warm bands of gold, a familiar vehicle appeared at the end of the gravel road. A silver SUV. Eleanor's breath caught. Ryan stepped out first. He looked around the clearing cautiously, as though unsure what he would find. Elise followed, shielding her eyes from the sun as she scanned the ridge. Neither of them spoke immediately. Eleanor walked toward them slowly. "You're far from Cleveland," Ryan said, attempting a light tone that didn't quite land. "You are too," she replied gently. They had expected something different. That much was clear. Perhaps they imagined her isolated, struggling, regretting. Instead, they found several strangers standing near the path, speaking quietly among themselves. They saw the wooden sign, the small markers along the slope. They saw Milo. He approached them calmly, tail steady, posture confident. Elise knelt automatically, scratching behind his ears. "He looks different," she said softly. "He has work," Eleanor replied. Ryan glanced toward the ridge. "What is this place, Basatsu?" he asked. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she led them up the path. Visitors stepped aside respectfully as they climbed. Some nodded politely, unaware of the deeper dynamic unfolding. At the upright stone, Ryan paused. "L," he began, but stopped. Inside the chamber, Elise grew quiet. She read the names slowly. She studied the photographs pinned carefully inside protective sleeves that families had contributed. "These were never returned?" she asked. "Not all," Eleanor said. Ryan stood near the entrance, looking at the timber supports. "You found this?" "Milo did," Eleanor answered honestly. They stepped back into the sunlight. From the ridge, the clearing below appeared alive. Cars parked, children walking carefully, adults speaking in low tones. Ryan's expression shifted gradually. Not confusion, not disbelief. Something closer to recalibration. "You've built something," he said. Eleanor considered the word. "I uncovered something," she corrected gently. "They're the ones building." As they descended, an older woman approached Eleanor, holding a small framed photograph. "Thank you," she said simply. Eleanor nodded. Ryan watched the exchange. Later, as the sun dipped and most visitors began preparing to leave, Eleanor stood with her children near the camper. The camper itself now looked less temporary. A small wooden deck had been constructed beside it by volunteers. Flower pots sat near the steps. A bench faced the ridge. "You're not alone out here," Elise said quietly. "No," Eleanor replied. Ryan looked at Milo, who stood facing the ridge once more, but not rigidly, not guarded, content. "I thought this was impulsive," Ryan admitted. "I thought you were running." Eleanor looked at the land stretching before them. "I was," she said softly. "Just not from what you think." He didn't press further. As twilight deepened, the last vehicle pulled away. The clearing settled into evening, while Ryan and Elise lingered beside their car. "We'll come back," Elise said. Eleanor nodded, but she did not cling to the promise. When they finally drove away, she did not feel the hollow ache she once would have. She stood beside Milo at the base of the ridge. 3 months. The land that had once been described as forgotten now held footsteps again. People did not come out of curiosity alone. They came because something here answered a question they had carried quietly for years. Milo stepped forward and climbed a few yards up the path before stopping and looking back at her. He did not need to guide anyone at that moment. He simply stood as a reminder. The ridge was no longer something he guarded. It was something he revealed. And Eleanor, watching the last light fade through the trees, understood that she no longer needed permission to remain here. The land did not require validation. It required presence. 3 months ago, she had arrived with uncertainty. Now, she stood in the center of something she had never intended to create, and she did not feel small inside it. She felt steady. Morning arrived softly over the ridge. A thin layer of mist hovered above the clearing, drifting slowly between the trees as sunlight filtered through in pale ribbons. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke from somewhere farther down the valley. Eleanor sat on the bench beside the camper, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Milo lay at her feet, his breathing slow and even. Below the ridge, a few early visitors walked the marked path in quiet conversation. Their footsteps were gentle, almost reverent, but no one rushed. No one raised their voice. The land did not demand noise. It invited presence. Eleanor watched as a young couple paused near the upright stone. The woman placed her hand against it briefly, as if greeting an old friend. The man stood beside her, holding a photograph against his chest. Farther up, near the chamber entrance, an older gentleman removed his hat and bowed his head for a moment before stepping inside. 3 months ago, this place had greeted her with silence so heavy it pressed against her lungs. Now the silence felt different. It was not emptiness. It was space between stories. She thought back to the night after the funeral, the house in Cleveland, the hollow quiet that had stretched through every room. She had believed then that her life had narrowed, that the world had shrunk to what was gone. Well, here, something unexpected had happened. The land had widened her instead, not through grandeur, not through sudden fortune, through listening. Milo stirred and lifted his head, watching as a small group approached the clearing. Among them was Clara, her dark hair pulled back as before. She waved when she saw Eleanor. Behind her walked 2 children she had not brought the first time. "They wanted to see where Great-Grandpa worked," Clara called gently. Eleanor stood and walked to meet them. The children looked around with wide, curious eyes, not afraid, not somber, just attentive. Milo stepped forward and stood calmly beside them. "He really did find it?" one of the children asked. Clara smiled. "He let us back," she said. Eleanor felt the words settle into her again. Back. Back to names. Back to stories. But back to something that had never been meant to disappear. As the group began the climb up the ridge, Eleanor remained at the base for a moment longer. She looked out over the clearing. The small wooden sign stood weathered but upright. The bench she sat on bore faint marks from many visitors. The path showed gentle wear, but no damage, only evidence of care. She had not rebuilt houses. She had not unearthed gold. She had simply stayed. Milo returned from escorting the group halfway up and settled beside her again, resting his head against her knee. His fur caught the sunlight in soft streaks of gold and black. "You're done watching," she murmured to him. He no longer stood rigid at the ridge's edge. He no longer paced at night. He had found what he was looking for. And so had she. The forest hummed quietly around them, and a breeze moved through the trees, carrying faint echoes of voices higher up the slope. The place that once felt like the edge of nowhere now felt like a center point, where past and present met without conflict. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly and let the sound of footsteps drift toward her.
She had come here, believing she was starting over. Instead, she had stepped into something already waiting. It is simply waiting for someone willing to listen, to care, and to stay long enough for the two to find its way back. Elena opened her eyes. Mala rose and looked toward the ridge, not girding, not urging, just present. The land had never been empty, and neither was he. 3 months Elias. Elena thought he was buying forgotten land for $5. What she really found was a place where silence had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to care enough to uncover it. Sometimes, healing doesn't arrive with noise or applause. It arrives when we choose to stay. If you were in Elena's place, would you have turned back on the first night, or climbed the bridge anyway? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late to begin again, stay with us for the next one.